Right, I think we'll go ahead and start. And I will endeavor to talk over the cab honking. I understand there's a problem with parking spaces, which is why they're registering their discontent. Anyway, good afternoon to everyone. My name's Wendy Fenton, and I'm the Humanitarian Practice Network Coordinator. And we're hosted here by the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. And I'd like to give a big welcome to all of those in the room, but also the 107 people who've signed up to participate online in today's event, which is called Everybody Wins, Bridging the Gap Between Science and Local Communities, Scientific and Local Communities. And I think, as we all know, at-risk people in communities, humanitarian and development agencies, and those with formal scientific and technological training, they're all producers and users of disaster risk knowledge, but they have different ideas about what's useful and important information. And the challenge is in bringing together this wealth of local and scientific knowledge to help communities become more resilient in the face of disasters. And so one important and interesting way of promoting that dialogue, that necessary dialogue, and supporting the decision-making processes are these participatory games and exercises. So during today's event, we'll have an interesting mix, I hope, of debate, games, and workshop demonstrations led by Emma Vizman, who's on my left, and she's the author of Network Paper 76, which is called Knowledge is Power, Unlocking the Potential of Science and Technology to Enhance Community Resilience Through Knowledge Exchange. That's quite a long title, but it's well worth knowing that for the information in the report. And Emma's going to be joined by Professor Dominic Kniveton from the University of Sussex, who's on my right, and Pablo Suarez from the Red Cross, who's joining us via Skype. You can see him on the screen. And Dr. Randolph Kent from King's College, who's just here on my far right. They're going to take us through some interactive exercises, such as telephone, which reveals how early warning messages can become distorted and confusing through poor dissemination, and a scenario game that challenges decision-making skills to determine the most essential disaster preparedness and response actions. And afterwards, we're going to open the floor to you here and our colleagues online for questions and comments. And while the event is going to end at 5 p.m., we hope that you'll stay, now that there's no tube strike, and join us for refreshments in the lounge outside. And before we get started, I just wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. Should you hear a fire alarm, please go through the doors and go to the right and out past reception and out of the building. And please do put your phones on silent, but feel free to tweet about the event or anything else that you'd like. And the hashtag for the event is NP76. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. I thought we might be losing one. The attrition rate is high here. And first, on my far right, as I said, we have Dr. Randolph Kent. And he's going to open today's event by explaining why it's so important to make more effective use of scientific understandings of both risk and opportunities for enhancing resilience. And I think he really doesn't need any introduction, because we know that Randolph was the director of the Humanitarian Futures program at King's College, but he's done so many things in his previous life. I'll just name a few. These include serving as the UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Somalia in 2002, UN humanitarian coordinator in Kosovo, 1999, and UN humanitarian coordinator in Rwanda, 1994 to 95. He has also been in Sudan as the chief of the UN Emergency Unit and the chief of Emergency Prevention and Preparedness in Ethiopia, 87 through 89. So an extremely distinguished and experienced panelist that we have with us today. So I'm going to hand over to Randolph and introduce the rest, keep you in suspense, and introduce the rest of our panelists after he introduces the session. Randolph.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And I assume the microphones are on?
Yes.
Yep, fine. First of all, thank you very much, ODI and HPN, for actually having the vision to see the importance of what I think Emma's work represents, along with Dominic. So with that, let me just say that one of the things that concerns me as we look into this science dialogue with communities is two things. One is, how do you deal with the inherent uncertainty and ambiguity that must, in one way or another, be reflected in that dialogue. And the second thing that worries me, but I think there are answers, is how do you sustain it? And with that, let me put this in the context of two events that will be coming soon. One is the Hyogo Framework for Action, and the second is the World Humanitarian Summit. But let me very briefly just discuss for a second this question of ambiguity and uncertainty. I was talking the other day to someone who had been a very senior official in DEFRA, Cabinet Office, a senior advisor on science, etc. And I opened up our very brief discussion with, well, you must be very worried about the problems that you've seen in the Somerset levels. To which he said, why? It was an extraordinary success. And I said, well, how would you explain that as an extraordinary success? And he said, if you take a look, the London Thames barrage only opened up twice, which means that Somerset might have suffered, but London was saved. And then I said, well, that's fantastic. Why don't you announce this? Why don't we hear more of this? And the answer was, are you crazy? Do you realize the political implications of the people in Somerset saying, we were sacrificed to those urban causes? Now, my question really to you is, well, how do you deal with ambiguity in these kind of cases? What sort of explanations, if I tell you as someone who lives in Somerset that, listen, these are problems, but do you realize what the full consequences could be to the economy, to the country, etc.? How do I dialogue with you about that? Or does science and government hide a truth? How, is my question to you, do you deal with ambiguity? I think the second thing that really concerns me as well is I so admire the work that's come out of this whole science humanitarian dialogue that HPN has now published, and which I think Emma and Dominic have led on. But how is it sustained? And you know, it's interesting, there were two books that have come out very recently. One is called The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. And the second is The Zero Marginal Cost Society, The Internet of Things. And what fascinates me about these two books is that what they project is a society that maybe very few of us recognize. It is a society where, because of robotics and technologies, the distance between human beings and production now increase. The first book sees this as a positive. The second book also as a potential positive. But my real question is, how are you engaged in this? How do these kind of innovations, technology, etc., are dealt with by you, the community, you, the individual? And you can say, well, it's easy. In the, dare I say it, developed world, that these problems are reconcilable. I say to you, if you take a look at these problems, it's not a question of reconciling, it's a question of identifying the deep divisions within society where vulnerability will be increasing in our own society, as well as other societies that we used to call and should no longer call the developing societies. So my question to you is, how do you sustain the dialogue? How do you, community, engage? How do you put your own opinion forth? Now, let me put this in the context of what you might call international frameworks. As all of you know, in 2015, there'll be the Hyogo Framework for Action Review, Hyogo Framework 2. And a year later, there'll be the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 in Turkey. And here, I think, are two wonderful opportunities to demonstrate the importance of science-humanitarian development dialogue. But how are we going to approach it? Will the development people say, this is what we need, and this is the way we do things? And will the humanitarians say, science, well, this is what we need from you? Or will there be a real dialogue? Will there be a real attempt to understand the language of science and what science means and what they understand by threats and vulnerabilities, rather than imposing the language of development and humanitarian discourse? So how, in other words, are we going to deal with language that can sustain partnerships and relationships, both at the Hyogo Framework for Action and with the World Humanitarian Summit? And I think part of the answer is what we are trying to do today. What are the games? What are the tools? What is the discourse? How do we engage? It's fundamental, not only for where we are now, but for where we will be in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randolph. Well, that's a very good introduction, and I'm now going to take away the suspense and introduce Emma Vizman, who is on my left. And Emma, as I said earlier, is the author of the network paper, and she is an independent consultant to the UK Met Office and visiting senior research fellow at King's College London. And Emma's been working with humanitarian and development operational and policy research organizations for more than 20 years. And most recently, she was with the Humanitarian Futures Program at King's College. And in 2011, she received a 2-year knowledge exchange fellowship with the UK Natural Environment Research Council. And the activities undertaken during the fellowship have included developing an online resource of knowledge exchange or dialogue approaches, and coordinating an exchange between climate scientists, meteorologists, at-risk communities in Kenya and Senegal, and partnering with humanitarian development agencies. And all of this work has fed into this paper and other bits of work that Emma's been involved in. So now I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to give us an overview of the paper and talk about the overall approach and the principles of knowledge exchange. Emma?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Wendy. And thank you very much to ODI and the Humanitarian Practice Network for supporting this initiative. As has already been mentioned, it's work that's come from the Humanitarian Futures Programme, which was at King's College London, and their efforts since 2006 to support strengthened science-humanitarian dialogue. And what we're really trying to do with this initiative is look at those approaches which have been effective in supporting relevant science, supporting at-risk groups. So we're looking for practical approaches which result in practical benefits for at-risk groups. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of really interesting work going on internationally, different countries and regions, but very few spaces where we're able to pull together this learning and really find out what's a generic learning about approaches which really do work in these situations. I'd really note from the outset that this is aiming to support practical benefits. The approaches that we've documented in the paper, such as early warning, early action, which we'll be looking at a bit later on, this has been scaled up to more than 10 African countries, been undertaken at community, district, national, regional levels. The participatory scenario planning of CARES has been undertaken now in Kenya for this rainy season in the majority of the counties, Kenya's newly established counties, at both county level and sub-county level. These are practical approaches. This is not academic exercises. These are really resulting in tangible benefits for at-risk people. So what is the initiative? At the moment, it comprises the network paper, which you have seen, which is really synthesizing learning from across different regions, disciplines, hazard types, and it's really building on the expertise and experience of a number of partners. Pablo Suarez is joining us remotely, but the work of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre has been instrumental in really pulling learning about these effectives and how we can identify the ones which really do support at-risk groups. So there's a paper which seeks to bring together generic learning from across these different initiatives. There's an annex of case studies which gives more detail on each of the initiatives and the impact that they have achieved, the methodologies that they employ. And there's also an accompanying website, which again we'll look at a little bit later on, which brings together even a wider group of case studies of approaches which have proved effective. I'd only mention really that the paper may seem to be authored by me, but it pulls on expertise and experience of a wide range of partners from across Southeast Asia, South America, Australasia, Pacific Islands, East and West Africa. And it's only by pulling together this expertise, which hasn't found a space to be coalesced, that we really have the learning from that is in this paper. You can have the next slide, please. So what are we trying to do here? We're trying to create a space for ongoing two-way dialogue. This space, without this space, we cannot bring together the different knowledge sources that are essential to make better use of science. It's only by bringing together scientific and local knowledge that we can really contextualize scientific understanding of risk. And it's only by providing an ongoing two-headed channel for communication that we can make sure that this process is not just a one-off workshop. It's not just a question of one exercise. It's an ongoing channel that we really require. And within that process, we really need to think about a number of different stages. Helping people get access to relevant information. Helping people understand what that information is telling them. What is the level of confidence and uncertainty within the information? And how are we going to use that information appropriately? So it's very much a process and requiring a channel for ongoing dialogue. And I think people that have taken part in these processes, particularly the scientists, have been very surprised by the level of capacity of communities at risk to really bring their own issues to see how they can inform the scientific research agenda, and the fact that they're very used to taking on uncertainty. When we first started this exercise, a lot of the climate scientists were worried about conveying uncertain probabilistic information. But what they found is that communities are well able to take on this information. It's rather the policymakers that seem to have the problem. The next slide, please. So while we're thinking about bringing together this learning, and as I said, there doesn't seem to be a space at the moment for really allowing that, it's clear that when you do this kind of work, it has to be tailored to a specific context. Each community has slightly different needs, slightly different situations, living in a multi-hazard environment. But what's also very clear is that there is generic learning that's coming out of these approaches, and there are ways to fast-track this kind of work. So we're thinking about identifying the approaches which have been effective and identifying some common principles which could support work in this area. So there's a set of principles, they're work in progress, and they're in the paper. What I just bring out here is a number of issues. What we really need to think about is being honest in conveying the level of confidence and uncertainty in the information. If we're not honest, if we try and give people too easy a ride, convey information which is inherently probabilistic in simple, deterministic ways, we A, risk increasing vulnerability, and B, increase mistrust in scientific information. When a seasonal forecast is given without conveying the levels of probability, if the less likelihood event happens, people then mistrust the information. It's very closely linked to the issue of accountability. This kind of work often brings together partners who haven't been used to working together before. Communities, policymakers and scientists often haven't had the opportunity to have this kind of dialogue. And when we're doing this work, we really need to think about the accountability of all the partners involved, whether that be the communities themselves. Once they've given the information, are they going to actually act on it if they've got the resources to do so? Policymakers, if they're given the information, they need to be held accountable for what they do with that information, how it informs their prioritization, how it informs their policies and programs. And scientists, I think scientists are beginning to really realize that they're going to be held accountable both for the quality or reliability of their information and also for the way in which they provide that information. How well are they conveying the reliability within the information? I think the instance of the earthquake scientists in Italy, there was an earthquake in 2009, and in 2012, a number of the earthquake scientists involved in communicating information about the risk of earthquake were in fact convicted for providing inaccurate or information in inappropriate ways. Then I think we need to bear in mind that this kind of work is risky. Obviously it's about risk, it's risky, but bigger than that, it does require a process of learning. It's a difficult process of providing risk information, helping people use that appropriately. And we need to allow both opportunities for innovation, but also opportunities that really safeguard those most vulnerable who we are trying to support with this risk information. Another issue that I think is going to be brought out very clearly within this session is that when we're trying to do this work, it touches people in a very different kind of way. When we're trying to do education through entertainment, it engages people in a very different kind of learning. They experience it themselves, and the resulting follow-up is very different to the standard kind of PowerPoint one-way dissemination process. Last slide, please. So just some key issues that I think we bear in mind when we're looking at some of the exercises that we'll do in this session. One is this issue about space for dialogue. At the moment, there aren't the spaces for dialogue, both to support science being integrated and informing decision-making at all different levels, whether that be international, regional, national, sub-state, local, city level. We need those opportunities and spaces for dialogue so that science can really inform decision-making. But also, as I alluded to at the beginning, I think we really need to create spaces for people engaged in this kind of work to have the opportunity to learn from each other. Otherwise, we're at risk of reinventing the wheel. Everybody's undertaking very interesting initiatives, but there's no space to really share learning. We need more inclusive systems of risk governance. It's not just a question of giving people access to information. They need access to the resources to act on that information. And I think at-risk groups can prove very exciting partners for scientists. They identify new research questions. They make sure that that research which is being undertaken already is focused on community concerns. And it's not to deny the need for blue skies thinking, but it is to make sure that the research which is being undertaken does support at-risk groups. And finally, as regards the implications of this work for humanitarian and development organisations, it has huge implications. It has implications both for their own policies and programmes, for their issues of accountability, to make sure that their policies and programmes are appropriately informed by relevant scientific understandings of risk. But also they have a tremendous role to play as intermediaries, both in communicating risk information to communities and partners, but also being this vital feedback channel to make sure that people are aware of how the risk information was used, what the benefits were, and most importantly, how it can be improved and strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. We're now going to move to Pablo, who is joining us by video link from Boston, I believe. Are you there? You're there, Pablo. There, I can see you.
Yes. Hello, everybody.
Yes, we're really happy that you could join us, Pablo. And I have a feeling it's horribly early there, but maybe it's not too bad. And I also apologize because I've misrepresented the game that you're actually going to be leading us through, which I believe is called ROMO, a fast game on probabilities and disaster preparedness. Is that right? Okay.
Correct.
Well, before I let you go ahead and take us through that, let me just introduce you properly. So Pablo is the Associate Director for Research and Innovation at the Red Cross, where he leads the team's initiatives linking applied knowledge with humanitarian work, as well as new approaches to climate risk management, including participatory games for learning and dialogue. And in the past, he's consulted for the United Nations Development Program, the World Food Program, Oxfam America, and about 20 other international humanitarian development organizations, working in more than 50 countries. So again, a very experienced person. And Pablo, without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for this invitation. It's great to be able to join you despite the distance. And technology has worked so far, so let's all hope it keeps going that way. I'm going to invite the panelists to join the crowd, sit in some empty seat if there are any empty seats. So I was given 10 to 15 minutes, and my hope is to help convey to those in the room and maybe those who are present online what Randall means when he says that we have to learn how to deal with language, the language of risk. I'm a researcher on climate and disasters. My job for the past decade has been to help Red Cross, Red Crescent staff, volunteers, partners to understand and address the humanitarian consequences of climate change and extreme weather events. Most of the knowledge produced by science involves probabilities. There are things we know are more likely to happen or less likely to happen than under past circumstances. But how do we communicate that? Well, as you've begun to hear, at the Climate Center, we have been experimenting with games. By games, I mean playable system dynamic models. These are extremely simplified representations of reality, where you receive information about context, about threats, about options. With that limited information, you have to make decisions. Do you act or not? Do you act a little or a lot? And those decisions will have consequences. Like in the real world, disaster management, climate change adaptation, whatever we do has consequences. And unfortunately, we cannot know ahead of time whether the consequences will be good or bad, depending on whether we act or do not act. So let's get a flavor of this. What you see on the screen, if you can see both me and the PowerPoint slide, is 4 photos from different gameplay sessions. On the top left is a session held at the university in Vietnam with 350 students. On the top right is a snapshot from a game session we played with lead coordinating authors from IPCC. You can probably see the probability distribution function being shifted. That's how some scientists play games. On the bottom left, you can see yours truly throwing a frisbee at 130 people in the White House. And that was not a frisbee, that was a hurricane, and people physically had to duck to avoid being hit by the hurricane. And on the right is our preferred way of action, which is working with communities. These are folks in Namibia in the Caprivi Strip, literally running away from a flood that was simulated in a very playful game called Ready. So now you are no longer who you think you are. You have just become a disaster manager. You could be Red Cross, you could be government official, you can be any other organization. And in this game, which will hugely distort reality, okay? We know that the real world is complicated, but in this game, you have 2 choices. Each one of you will confront 2 choices. One is to do long-term investments in community resilience, and you will express that choice by doing this. Thumbs up. Can I see your thumbs, please? Everybody in the room. Just so I see. Great, thank you. Your other choice is if you think that a flood may be coming, that too much rain may be on its way, then you do this. This means protection against too much rain. Can I see you physically do this, please? All right, thank you. Can we advance the slide? Show the next PowerPoint slide, please. Thanks. So here are the rules. You are a disaster manager. Your row is your team. This game is played by teams, and the winning team will be the winning row that by the end of the game has the most players still playing. And it will be very quick. Emma, if you have the prize handy, would you like to show it? So, in your row, you may get that. It's not only a prize, okay? It's eternal fame and recognition of superior talents in disaster management and resilience building. So in this game, your row is your province. Each one of you is a disaster management coordinator, and you work as a team. And either your team wins or your team loses, regardless of whether you as an individual are standing or sitting. As mentioned, you have two choices. One is long-term investments, hoping there's no flood. The other one is protection against too much rain. You will all start the game standing, and we will play a sequence of seasons. So everybody stand up. Thank you very much. Now, this is all the information you receive. For this coming season, like most seasons, the chances of a flood are about 15%. 15%. That's all the information you have. And you have to choose what you do as an individual. Do you go for long-term investments, or do you go for investment in flood protection? Now, very importantly, as the slide shows, if you get it wrong, you have to sit down. You no longer play as an individual. If you go for long-term investment and there's a flood, you fail to act, it's a disaster. You sit down. You're basically helping others recover. You should have protected, you didn't. Response is much more work. Now, if you invest in protection and the flood doesn't happen, guess what? In this game, you're fired because you wasted resources in doing the wrong thing. So that's all the information you have. You have literally 30 seconds. Go ahead and think, what are you, each one of you individually going to do? Remember, the row is what determines the winner, so you could have some protecting against flood and some going for long term. If you get it wrong, you sit down. You have 30 seconds. Think with your partners. The rainy season is coming. You have 10 seconds. By the end of the countdown, you're either like this or like that. 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, by the end of the countdown, you have to adopt one of the two positions. 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay. Sorry, sir, in the back row. I said stop, and 3 seconds later you went like this. That means that you signed the form to send the driver to place the tent too late. So you have to undo your preparedness. In the real world, there's timeliness that matters. So we said 15% chance. In this game, we're going to represent that with a normal die. 6 sides. This is a flood. Everything else is no problem. If this is what happens, those like this stay standing. If anything else happens, those like this stay standing. If you got it wrong, you sit down. Let's see what happens. I'm going to aim to the floor. So, if you got it wrong, sit down. There's very few rows still competing. Okay, round number 2. What are you going to do? You have 15 seconds to make your decision. Are you going to protect against flood, or are you going to invest in long-term development? I'm going to throw this one again. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay, check this out. If I saw the room correctly, about half of the participants are investing in flood protection, even though it's vastly the least likely outcome, okay? There's 86% chance of no flood, and more than half of you are doing this. That speaks to me as vastly incompetent mathematicians in the room, but maybe you get it right. Okay, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. All right. So some of you have to sit down. Now we move on to the last round. There are how many players standing? Can you show? 4 players distributed in how many rows? 4 rows? 4 rows. Okay, so now it's a row battle. Last season, can someone advance the PowerPoint slide and show the next one? This is an actual forecast. Is it showing?
Yes.
There we go, loading presentation. This is an actual forecast that literally physically arrived to the Disaster Management Coordinator Officer in West Africa in 2008. He received it in May, and it referred to the period between June and August 2008. You are in one of those dark green pixels. What the forecast says is that if you define extreme event as the highest 15% of the historical record, this season, because of sea surface temperatures and all those weird things that scientists talk about, your probability is enhanced. Probability of too much rain, probability of flood, is enhanced from 15% to between 40 and 50%. That's all the information you have. What are you going to do? Are you going to invest in hoping there's no flood, normal long-term investment, or are you going to invest in flood protection? Each one of you, in consultation with your rows, you have 30 seconds or less. Seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. Okay, can I see in a pan of the room anyone operating the camera? All right, we have some like this, some like that. Not everyone will win, okay? So on a normal season, this is 1 in 6 chance of flood, or 15%. This season, it's going to be 50%. I'm going to flip this as if it were a coin. If it falls like this, it means flood. Good idea to go like this. If it falls like this, it means no flood. Good idea to go like that. That's what your forecast said, okay? You go from 1 in 6 to 1 in 2. Let's aim downwards. Flood.
We have a winner.
This was a, let me check the time here. All right, we just spent about 7 minutes. Can you hear me, guys? Yeah. We just spent about 7 minutes explaining in a playful mode what science can say about likely future conditions. If I know nothing, the chances of a disaster are maybe 1 in 6. When science tells me something, it tells me something that helps make decisions. This is more worth it on such a year than on a normal year. If you go from 15% to 50%, it's like going from rolling a die to flipping a coin. Now, this very simple concept is something that most decision makers have no idea about. When they receive a seasonal forecast, they simply cannot understand what's being said. And in our experience, if we represent information within the context of a decision framework embedded in a game, people get it. People understand the consequences of failing to act and understand the consequences of acting in vain. Now, in your game, the consequences of getting it wrong were identical, whether you did nothing and there's a disaster or whether you acted and there's no disaster. As we know in the real game, in the real world, it's different, right? if you don't invest in flood preparedness and there's a flood, there's real human suffering. There may be a loss of life. Whereas if you invest in flood preparedness and the flood doesn't happen, most of what you lose is money and to some extent reputation. So these are not easy to put on a scale and see what you do, what you don't do. What we're doing now with the Climate Center, with the help of many partners, is to advance the idea of financing mechanisms that are linked to forecasts, so that if the probability of a disaster exceeds a certain threshold of acceptable risk, if the risk is too high, then we have money in a pot that says, go and invest in preparedness. And there's no firing people because they acted in vain, because we collectively agree that it's worth taking action based on the forecast. Now, let me be candid with you. If we didn't have games, we wouldn't even dare try it, because it's just not easy to communicate and to try out different scenarios. What if I do? What if I don't? What if the disaster happens or doesn't happen? If we can advance to the next slide, please. You're going to see those are some of the organizations to which we are very grateful for their support in our work on games, including ODI. Our work with Accra was very interesting in Mozambique, Ethiopia, and Uganda. With local government officials. CDKN has been one of the most important supporters of our exploration of games and development with the American Red Cross. And then we've played games with all sorts of partners, from universities to government officials, members of parliament, UN organizations, donors. Generally speaking, in my opinion at least, without a doubt, gameplay is a much better way to promote learning and enhance dialogue. As you can see in the report that Emma shared with you, there are ways in which games open up people's minds, linking the intellectual side with the emotional side and exploring the space of possibility. What can happen? What can I do? What can we do? And what are the trade-offs? The trade-offs between the individual and the collective, the trade-off between the short term and the long term. There's many ways that games can be designed to explore these things. If any of you are interested in learning more, you can go to climatecenter.org. There's a page on games, and there's all sorts of resources, videos for training facilitators, publications, journal articles. June 25 to 27, we'll be teaching a 3-day course at University of Lugano on games for humanitarian and development work. And the other thing I should mention now that time is running out is that your work, whatever it is that you do, if it has to do with risks, I'm sure it's difficult. Games can make it easier for you to be successful. It has made my work life much more fun, but also much more serious. We have access to spaces like this space where you are convened now, because what we offer with games gets the heartbeat going and gets the brain cells going. So with big thanks to you all, Emma, please give the prize to be shared among the winning rows. And I thank you very much for your attention and collaboration. Thanks very much.
Pablo, thank you very much for that. That was both very instructive as well as extremely entertaining. I'm only sorry that my row lost. And can I recall my panelists to the table, please? Okay. Now I'm sorry. Let me just find my notes here. I think that was extremely interesting, and we're going to carry on with the game theme. Emma now is going to lead us through the early warning, early action scenario exercise.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask, is it okay to use this and move around?
We have another microphone, I think. Yeah.
Okay. This is another game developed by the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, and unfortunately our colleague Aram Tal, who developed this game, is not able to join us. She's busy developing global framework for climate services in, at the moment, I think Tanzania and Malawi. But anyway, she sends her best wishes, and she's very happy that we have this opportunity to use her game. And I should just give a brief background. This exercise has been trialled, as I mentioned at the beginning, in more than 10 African countries. And it's really aiming to support a dialogue between different communities of practice, different decision makers working at different levels. And we've used it at very many different levels and opportunities. And this small snapshot that we're going to do now, we actually undertook with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, in a disaster risk reduction workshop in Niger last year. And some of that background will become clear as we play the game. And normally we do it in a slightly extended version, so this will be very summary. What we usually do is undertake this exercise as part of a much bigger kind of workshop which goes on for several days, but this is one exercise that we found particularly useful for promoting dialogue between different disciplines, between different communities of practice. I would ask for 4 willing volunteers who will sit here and join us for this exercise. And I'd like to have, if possible, depending on how eclectic the group is here, some representation from different kinds of groups. So first of all, I need a scientist, either a natural scientist or a social scientist, somebody who would call themselves a scientist. Do we have any scientists here? Please come forward. Can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
My name's Hannah. I'm from the University of Reading.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got Hannah from Reading. Now we need a practitioner, somebody who would think of themselves as a humanitarian or development practitioner. Thank you. And can I just ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I'm a field manager for Doctors Without Borders.
Great. So we've got Ivan, Doctors Without Borders, and somebody from Reading. Now we need somebody who would think of themselves as a policymaker, and preferably somebody who had like international or regional policy making experience or expertise. What do other people think of themselves as? It's very interesting. Anybody who would think of themselves as a policymaker? Anybody who would think of themselves as a donor or funding agency? Please. I can't believe the one about policymakers. I'm going to quiz you in a minute.
My name's Anne, and I'm a program advisor with the Salvation Army.
Thank you very much. Very good. So I need either a policymaker or I'm going to start again from the scientist, but knowing scientists, I'd rather have a policymaker.
I've supported donors in developing policy. I don't know if that counts.
That'd be great. Thank you very much, sir. So if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Bobby Lambert. I've supported donors in developing policy.
Thank you very much. Pablo, I hope you can hear us okay? Yeah, great. Okay, so what we're going to do is have a small round of early warning, early action. And what I want these colleagues to do here is to look at 2 forecasts. As I say, we normally do this at a number of different forecast timeframes, but today we're just going to introduce 2 forecasts. And we have a decadal forecast, a forecast for 10-year period, and a seasonal forecast. And just in case you think you're going to be let off the hook, you in the audience will also be required to do this exercise, so don't switch off, please. And if I could get the next slide, please. Right. I want you all to imagine that you are a senior decision maker in the Economic Community of West African States. All of you, in fact. All of you are a senior regional decision maker for the Economic Community of West African States and in their secretariat. And when you get the seasonal forecast, I want you to think of one key action that you think you would take with that forecast. So I will provide these colleagues with some paper in a minute to write what their action will be. But if we could just go back one slide again. Sorry. Now, when we play this game, the key thing is that everyone gets to be a decision maker. You get the forecast, but everybody gets a turn at being the decision maker. So you have the forecast, you have to take individually a decision about what you would do with that forecast, write it on a piece of paper, and then you give it to the decision maker for that round. With each round, the role of decision maker moves around the group. So actually, when you play this game or exercise with a mixed audience, people who are often not allowed to be the decision maker get a chance to really decide. So what we're going to do is we'll give you the forecast, you take an action, you give it to the decider, and for this round we'll have the first decision maker being this person. You give your action to this person. She will look at the various options and she will decide which one she wants to take. She will then let the group know, and the group can dispute. You can play this exercise also with a process of points and so on, but we're doing it in an abbreviated version here, and in fact we haven't used points before. So, now then, if we can go on. Right. I will let our colleagues start here. If you could have a look at the forecast that we have, the decadal outlook for 2011-2020. I'll read it out in a minute. For those who can read it, please start reading. Meantime, I'm going to ask our colleagues here to start thinking about one action they would take as a regional decision maker for the economic community of West African states with this 10-year forecast.